The palace of the Valan Ascendancy floated in the high, thin air above the world of Semira, a city of white spires strung together by bridges of light. And on the night the young prince vanished from it, not a single alarm sounded until it was already far too late. That was the part no one could explain afterward. The Valan were a proud and ancient people, tall and silver-skinned, with eyes like polished amber and a memory that ran back 40,000 years without a single gap. They had crossed between stars before humanity had learned to bury its dead. Their guardians did not sleep. Their sensors did not blink. And yet, somewhere in the quiet hour before the second moon rose, a small warm bed in the royal nursery had gone cold and empty, and the child who had been sleeping in it, Prince Ilving, 7 years old, heir to the throne of 100 worlds, was simply gone. Queen Sarana of the Valan learned of it the way she learned of everything, with perfect composure, her face betraying nothing. She had ruled for 3 centuries. She had signed treaties and refused them, had ended 2 wars and prevented a 3rd, had watched her own mother die and had not wept where anyone could see. When the chamberlain came to her at the hour before dawn, his silver skin gone gray with terror, and told her that the prince's bed was empty and the guardians had found no trace, she did not scream. She did not fall. She rose from her chair, walked to the great window that looked out over the sleeping city and stood very still, and only her hands, clasped behind her back, fingers white where they gripped one another, gave away what was happening inside her. "Find him," she said. They tried. The Valan turned their whole civilization toward the search the way a flower turns toward a sun. Every sensor on Semira was retasked. Every ship in the home fleet was called back. Analysts pored over 10,000 hours of recorded stillness and found nothing, and then found something, and the something was worse than nothing. There had been a gap. For exactly 4 minutes and 11 seconds in the deepest hour of the night, the palace's entire recording network had shown the nursery as calm and occupied, a child sleeping peacefully, breathing safe. And it had been a lie. Someone had fed the guardians a loop of an earlier hour, a recording of a real and peaceful night, and while the machines watched that gentle fiction, they had taken the boy out through a service passage that should not have been openable, down through the roots of the floating city, and away. Whoever had done this had known the palace better than the palace knew itself. The Valan called it the silence later because there was no other word for how completely the trail vanished. No ransom came, no claim of responsibility, no demand. The child was simply erased from the universe as far as anyone could tell, and after 9 days of searching that spanned 6 star systems and turned up precisely nothing, the great council of Valan lords gathered in the throne hall and did a thing that had never been done in the recorded history of their people. They advised the queen to grieve. Lord Kesh, oldest of them, silver skin gone the pale of old bone, stood before the throne and spoke the words no one else would say. "Great Queen, we have searched with everything we have. There is no trace. There is no world we have not turned. In our long memory, no child taken so cleanly has ever been recovered. To keep the fleet at war readiness serves no one now. We ask you to let the search become a mourning, so that the ascendancy may hold together while it heals." He meant it kindly. That was the terrible thing. He loved the boy too. Queen Sarana looked down at him from the high white throne, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. The hall was silent. 100 lords waited. "You are asking me," she said at last, "to bury a child I have not found." "Great Queen, to hold a funeral for a body that does not exist, to tell my people that their prince is dead when I do not know that he is dead, to choose the comfort of an ending over the labor of a hope." Her voice did not rise. It never rose. That was what made it terrible. "You ask me to be sensible, Lord Kesh, and you are right that it is sensible. And I will not do it." She rose from the throne. "I will hear every offer," she said. "From every corner of the galaxy, from every people, from every fool and mercenary and dreamer who thinks they can find my son, I will hear them. I will pay any price. I will owe any debt. If there is one being anywhere beneath these stars who can bring my child home, let them come to me, and I will not care what they are or where they crawled from. Send the word to everyone." The lords bowed because there was nothing else to do, and the word went out. It went out along the trade routes and the courier lines, through the great relay stations and the whisper networks of the smuggling clans, into places the Valan would never willingly have sent a message. It went out to the proud and the desperate, to the honorable, and to the kind of people who read a queen's grief as a market opportunity. Bounty hunters came, psychic seers came, and charlatans dressed as psychic seers. A cartel of information brokers came and offered to sell the Valan their own leaked search data at a premium. 3 separate warlords arrived within the same week, each promising to find the boy in exchange for weapons, and each was politely and thoroughly investigated and found to have nothing but ambition. 9 weeks passed, the trail already cold went colder. And on the 10th week, into the great receiving hall of the Valan Ascendancy, in a line of petitioners that included 2 admirals and a religious order and a being made entirely of coordinated light, there came a human. Her name was Rel Ashkum, and she was 24 years old, and she did not look like anything at all. That was the first thing the Valan protocol officer noted, with something close to offense. The petitioners who came before the queen dressed for it. They wore their ranks and their wealth and their reputations like armor. The human wore a patched flight jacket the color of old rust, boots that had been resoled more than once, and an expression of tired patience, as though she had spent a great deal of her life waiting in lines exactly like this one and had made her peace with it. She carried no honor guard. She carried a duffel bag. She was not tall, even for a human, and she was not beautiful in any way the Valan understood, and when the protocol officer asked her what house or fleet or company she represented, she said, "None of them. Just me," and the officer nearly turned her away right there. But the queen had said everyone, so the officer, disapproving, let her through. Rel Ashkum had come a long way to stand in that line. She had heard the word the way everyone in the outer systems had heard it, as a rumor, then a certainty, then a joke. The mad Valan queen who would pay anything. 100 hard people had gone to Semira already and come back with nothing if they came back at all, and the story had curdled into the kind of thing spacers told each other in bars to pass a long dock shift. "Don't get greedy," someone would say. "Remember the Silver Queen. Remember all the big names who went to find her kid and struck out. What makes you think you'd do better?" Rel hadn't thought she'd do better. That wasn't why she came. She came because she'd spent 4 years running salvage and courier work along the ragged edge of the Valan's territory, in the places the great powers didn't bother to map, and because in those 4 years she had learned a thing about that region that the admirals and the warlords and the psychic seers apparently had not. She had learned who actually lived out there. Not the powers, not the fleets, the small people, the wreckers and the ghost station squatters and the ones who moved cargo that didn't have papers. She knew their routes because she'd flown them. She knew their hiding places because she'd hidden in a few herself, waiting out a storm or a patrol. And 9 weeks of listening, really listening, in the bars and the docks and the long silent stretches between jumps, had taught her something that made her stomach turn. Someone out there had come into money. Recently, a crew that had been scraping by for years, running a converted ore hauler called the Deepwake out of a dead station in a system nobody official had a name for, had suddenly stopped taking cargo, stopped taking any work at all, had gone quiet in a way that broke crews go quiet only when they've been paid too much to talk. And when Rel had traced the timing of it, worked backward through the gossip and the fuel purchases, and the one drunk crewman who'd said too much before his captain shut him up. The money had come in 9 days after a child disappeared from a floating palace half a galaxy away. It wasn't proof. It wasn't anything a court would look at twice. It was a feeling in the gut, a pattern in the noise, The kind of thing you couldn't sell to an admiral because admirals dealt in certainties, and this was made entirely of shadows. But Rel Ashcombe had spent her whole life in the shadows, and she had learned to read them. So she stood in the line in her rust-colored jacket, with her duffel bag and her tired eyes, and when at last she came before the high white throne and looked up at the silver queen who could have crushed her whole life with a word, she did not bow the way the others had bowed, all sweeping and theatrical. She just inclined her head, the way you nod to someone you respect, and she said the truest thing she had. "Your Majesty, I don't have proof. I don't have a fleet. I can't promise you I'm right," she swallowed. "But I think I know where your son is. And I think everyone who's got the ships to go get him is asking the wrong questions in the wrong places, because they're looking for someone important enough to have done this, and they should be looking for someone small enough to have gotten away with it." The hall went very still. Queen Sorina looked down at the small human in the worn jacket, and for the first time in 70 days, something moved behind her amber eyes. It is worth understanding what the Valan thought of humans in those days, before this story changed it. They thought very little of them at all. Humanity was young, so young it was almost embarrassing. A species that had crawled out of its gravity well barely 3 centuries past, that still fought wars over lines drawn on a single small planet, that had spread itself thin across a handful of systems and called that an empire. The Valan had watched a dozen young species rise and most of them fall, and they had a settled, gentle contempt for the enthusiasm of the newly spacefaring. Humans were loud. Humans were fast. Humans threw themselves at problems, with a reckless disregard for the odds that the Valan found by turns amusing and appalling. Above all, the Valan valued patience, and humans had none. So when the word spread through the palace that the queen had granted an audience to a lone human courier with no fleet and no proof, the lords did not take it seriously. Lord Kesh, who had watched the whole procession of petitioners with grim tolerance, felt something close to despair. He had asked the queen to grieve, and instead she was clutching at every straw the galaxy blew past her, and now the straws had come down to this. A girl in a stained coat, talking about smugglers and feelings in her gut. He went to the queen that night in her private chambers, where the great window looked out over the city, and the 2 moons hung low and cold. "Great queen," he said, "the human, you cannot mean to fund her." Sorina did not turn from the window. Why not? Because she is nothing. She has no ships. She proposes to fly alone into the worst region of our borderlands, on the strength of a rumor about a broken freighter crew, and she asks for— What did she ask for? "Fuel," Sorina said, "a weapons refit for her own ship, and a fast courier drone so she can send word if she finds anything." A pause. "That is all she asked for, Kesh. The warlords asked for fleets, the brokers asked for fortunes, the seers asked for temples built in their names. She asked for fuel and 1 drone. Because she is a fool or a fraud." "Or," said the queen, and now she did turn, and her amber eyes were very steady, "because she is the only one who came to me and did not first tell me how certain she was." Kesh had no answer for that. "Every other petitioner," Sorina went on, "swore to me that they would succeed. The seer saw my son alive and well, he told me, in a garden by a blue lake. He was very specific, Kesh, very moving, and it was a lie, because there is no such lake in any place the boy could be. The warlords guaranteed victory. The brokers guaranteed results. Every one of them looked me in the eye and promised me a certainty they did not have, because they had learned that a grieving mother wants to be promised things." Her jaw tightened. "And this human stood in my hall and told me she might be wrong, that she had no proof, that she was only guessing, but that her guess was better than theirs because she had spent her life in the exact places they have never bothered to look." A breath. "Tell me, Kesh, in 300 years of ruling, which have you found more often to be liars? The ones who admit they might be wrong, or the ones who swear they cannot be?" Lord Kesh was silent for a long moment. He was old and he was wise in his way, and he knew the answer. The ones who swear, he said quietly. Yes. He bowed his head. It is still a terrible risk. If she is right and she goes alone and she fails, we may lose our only true lead. If we sent a fleet with her, a fleet would announce itself across half the sector before it arrived, Sarina said. You know this. If the boy is being held by people small and frightened and clever enough to have stolen him out from under us, then a fleet on the horizon is a death sentence. They will run, or they will do worse than run. She looked back out the window at the cold moons. No, if she is right, then the only thing that can save my son is exactly what she is, someone small enough to slip in where a fleet cannot go. And if she is wrong, then we have lost a little fuel and one drone, and I will hear the next petitioner in the morning. Her hands found each other behind her back and gripped. Give her what she asked for, Kesh, and give her the drone that flies fastest. If she finds him, I want to know the same hour. And so it was done, over the quiet objections of 100 lords, and in the gray morning Rel Ashkum walked out of the palace of the Valen Ascendancy with a full tank, a hard point mount she barely knew how to use, and a courier drone the size of a fist that could cross the sector in a day and a half. She did not celebrate. She did not feel triumphant. She stood on the landing platform in the thin, high air, looking out at the white spires and the drop below them, and she thought about a 7-year-old sleeping in a bed that had gone cold, and she felt the weight of the thing she had just taken on settle onto her shoulders like a wet coat. Then she shouldered her duffel, walked to her ship, an ugly, patched, faithful little courier boat called the Margin, and flew out into the dark to go do the thing the whole galaxy had said could not be done. The Margin was not a fighting ship, and Rel had no illusions about turning it into one. It was a courier boat, built for one thing, to carry a small cargo very fast across long distances, and to be too cheap and too fast to be worth chasing. It had a single overpowered drive, a hull thin enough that Rel could hear the metal breathe when she pushed it, and until 3 days ago, no weapons at all. The Valen technicians had bolted a plasma lance to the forward hardpoint with the air of people mounting a knife on a paper airplane, and Rel had thanked them, and privately decided that if she ever had to actually fire the thing, she'd already lost. She wasn't going out there to fight. She was going out there to find, and if she was very lucky and very careful, to steal something back. She spent the first 2 days of the journey doing the unglamorous work that nobody sang songs about. She sat in the cramped cockpit with cold coffee going colder, and she went back through everything, every rumor, every fuel receipt, every drunk crewman's half-sentence, and she built the shape of it out in her head the way she used to build maps of debris fields before a salvage run. Somewhere it fit together or it didn't. You couldn't force it. You just had to lay the pieces down honestly and see what pattern they made. The Deepwake, a converted ore hauler 30 years old, engines held together with prayer and patchwork. Crew of 11, maybe 12. Captain a man named Orsk Vandry, a human. That detail had bothered Rel, and then it had stopped bothering her and started making terrible sense. The Valen had been searching for aliens, for enemies of the crown, for some grand, shadowy conspiracy. But what if it had never been grand at all? What if it had just been a broken crew, deep in debt, offered more money than they'd see in 3 lifetimes to do one unspeakable thing? The Valen couldn't imagine it, Rel thought, because the Valen lived so long and remembered so much that they'd forgotten what desperation did to people who didn't. A Valen facing ruin had centuries to climb out of it. A human facing ruin had a bad year and a worse one, and then the walls came in. Vandry's crew had been drowning for a long time. Someone had thrown them a rope made of money and a stone tied to the end of it, and they'd grabbed it anyway, because drowning people grab whatever's offered. Which meant they were amateurs, which meant they were frightened, which meant, and this was the thin, sharp thread of hope Rel kept coming back to, which meant they probably hadn't hurt the boy. You didn't take a child that carefully, feed the guardians a perfect 4-minute lie, slip him out through a passage that shouldn't open, unless someone had paid you specifically to bring him back alive. A corpse was easy. A living hostage was hard. Whoever had hired the Deepwake wanted the prince breathing, or they'd never have gone to so much trouble. So there was a buyer. There was always a buyer. And the Deepwake was just the delivery boat, sitting on its cargo, waiting for the handoff, going quiet and rich and terrified in a dead system nobody had a name for. Rel had a name for it. She'd been there once, 4 years back, waiting out a solar storm. The old station in that system was a wreck called Tomb Harbor by the people who used it, a half-melted refinery platform in orbit around a burnt-out star, and it had exactly the qualities you'd want if you were a frightened crew sitting on the most dangerous cargo in the galaxy. It was off every official chart. It had no traffic, no patrols, no witnesses, and it had a docking ring that still held pressure, which in that part of space made it a palace. If she were Orsk Vandry, drowning in debt and terror, sitting on a stolen prince and waiting for a buyer who took their time, that's exactly where she'd hide. It wasn't proof, it was still just a feeling in the gut. But she was 3 days out now, and the feeling hadn't gone away, and that was as close to certainty as her kind of work ever got. She came into the dead system quiet. That was the whole art of it, and it was an art Rel had spent 4 years learning. Anyone could fly a ship. The trick, the thing that kept small people alive in dangerous places, was flying a ship as though it weren't there. She came in on a ballistic approach with the drive cold, coasting on momentum alone, using the burnt-out star's own bulk to hide her heat signature, drifting toward Tomb Harbor like just another piece of the debris that clotted the system. She'd done it 100 times to avoid patrols. She'd never done it with this much riding on getting it right. Tomb Harbor grew out of the dark ahead of her, and her breath caught because the Deepwake was there. It was docked hard against the old refinery's one live ring, an ugly slab of a ship, 30 years of patches and scars, its running lights dimmed to almost nothing. It looked exactly like what it was, a frightened animal gone to ground, hiding, trying to be small. Rel let the margin drift past at a distance that would read as harmless junk if anyone was watching. And someone was watching, she saw. A single sensor mast on the station's spine turning slowly, sweeping, and she held her breath and let her ship be junk until the mast had turned away. She parked the margin in the shadow of a dead cargo pod half a kilometer out, killed everything but life support, and she sat in the dark and she watched. For 11 hours she watched, because that was the other thing nobody sang songs about: the patience, the awful grinding patience of doing this right. She mapped the station's rhythms. She counted the sensor masts sweep, slow, lazy, understaffed, the watch of a crew that had been hiding a long time and was starting to believe no one would ever come. She watched a single figure in a pressure suit make a slow circuit of the docking ring twice, at intervals of roughly 6 hours, checking seals. She watched the Deepwake's ports, learned which ones showed light and which stayed dark, learned that the crew kept to the forward third of the ship and never went aft. And she watched one small port, low on the Deepwake's flank near the old ore holds, that stayed dark and sealed the entire time, except once in the 9th hour when the port cycled open for exactly long enough for a crewman to hand something through it and pull the hatch shut again. A tray. He'd handed a tray through. You didn't bring meals to an empty room. Rel let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for a decade. He was there. He was alive. He was in the aft holds in the dark, being fed by a crew too frightened to look at what they were feeding. Every piece of the shadow map she'd built in her head across 9 weeks, and 3 days had come down to one dim port and one tray of food, and it had held. He was there. Now came the hard part, which was that knowing where a thing is and being able to get it are 2 entirely different problems, and the second one is much, much worse. She could not fight her way in. That was the first and hardest truth, and she made herself look at it directly. There were 11 or 12 of them and one of her. Her ship had one clumsy weapon she barely knew how to fire, and theirs was an armored ore hauler with who knew what bolted on after 30 years in the worst part of space. If it came to a fight, she would lose, and worse than losing herself, she would lose the boy, because a frightened crew with a hostage and a battle on their hands does the one thing you cannot allow. It panics. She could not send for the fleet, either. She had the courier drone, and every part of her wanted to fire it back towards Semira with the coordinates and let the silver ships come and end this. But the Queen had understood the thing that Rel now understood in her bones. A fleet could not arrive quietly. The moment the Deepwake sensor mast caught the first Valen drive signature on the edge of the system, Orsk Vandry would have a choice to make. And every choice a cornered smuggler makes with a hostage aboard is a choice that ends with the hostage dead. He'd run and be run down. Or he'd bargain with the only chip he had and use the boy's life to buy his own. And even if the Valen agreed, Rel had seen enough handoffs go wrong to know how that ended. Or, in the worst and likeliest case, he'd simply do the math a frightened man does, that a dead witness can't testify, and space the child before the boarding parties reach the aft holds. No fleet. Not yet. The fleet was for after. The fleet was for once the boy was already out and safe and clear, and the only person who could make that happen was the small, tired woman in the rust-colored jacket, sitting alone in a cold ship in the dark, with no plan and one advantage. The advantage was this: they didn't know she existed. She turned that over and over. 11 of them, armed, dug in, alert to fleets and warships and the great powers of the galaxy. Utterly, completely blind to the possibility of one person in a junk courier who had already flown past their guard twice without being seen. Everything they'd built their defense around assumed an enemy that arrived loud. Rel arrived silent. That was the whole of her army, silence, and she was going to have to make it enough. She spent the next 2 days building a plan out of almost nothing, the way she'd once built a working salvage rig out of a debris field and stubbornness. She studied the station instead of the ship. Tomb Harbor was a refinery, and Rel had crewed on a refinery platform for one miserable year in her teens, and she knew how they were built, knew that behind the glossy live sections there were always the dead ones, the abandoned processing decks, the maintenance crawls, the old service passages that ran through the station's bones like veins. The Deepwake was docked to the one live ring. But the aft holds, where they were keeping the boy, those pressed right up against the station's old or transfer gantry, a dead structure the crew almost certainly hadn't bothered to explore, because why would they? They were hiding, not renovating. If she could get into the station's dead sections, if she could work her way through the maintenance crawls to the ore transfer gantry. If the gantry still made it to the Deepwake's aft cargo interface, the way refinery gantries were built to mate to ore haulers, and it would, because that was the whole reason a hauler docked at a refinery in the first place. Then there was a way into the aft holds that did not go through 11 armed men. There was a way in through the back. It was thin. It was held together with ifs. It assumed a dozen things she couldn't confirm from half a kilometer away in the dark, but it was a way that used the one thing she had, that she was small and quiet and unexpected, instead of the 11 things she didn't. And that, Rel had learned across a hard life, was the only kind of plan worth having. You didn't win by being stronger than the problem. You won by being shaped exactly wrong for the trap that had been set, so that the trap closed on empty air. She checked her suit. She checked the little cutting tool she used for salvage. She checked the sidearm she'd carried for 4 years and fired maybe twice, and she made herself accept that if she had to fire it in there, everything had already gone wrong. Then she wrote a short message and loaded it into the courier drone coordinates, the Deepwake's name, the plain fact that the prince was alive and aboard, and she did not launch it. Not yet. If she launched it now, the fleet would come and the boy would die. She would launch it the instant he was out. The drone would fly for Semira with the good news and the coordinates in the same breath, and the silver ships would come to catch the smugglers and take Rel and the boy home, and it would all be over. But first she had to get him out, alone, through the back of the station, past a crew of frightened, dangerous, drowning people who had done one unforgivable thing and would do worse to keep from paying for it. Rel Ashcombe sat in the dark of her cold little ship, and she was afraid. She'd have been a fool not to be. And she made herself think of the tray going through the dark port, the meal handed to a child in the black, and she let the fear settle into the thing it was supposed to become, which was not courage exactly, but resolve. A refusal. A flat, stubborn, human refusal to let it stand. She sealed her helmet, and she went to the airlock, and she stepped out into the dark toward the dead heart of Tomb Harbor. Space, up close and alone, is not the grand black velvet of the paintings. It is a hard, cold nothing that wants to kill you in 19 different ways, and it does not care about your reasons. Rel crossed the half-kilometer to Tomb Harbor without her thrusters, hand over hand along a drifting line of dead cargo pods, because a thruster flare would show up on that lazy sensor masked like a match struck in a dark room. It took her 40 minutes to cross a distance she could have flown in 90 seconds, and every one of those 40 minutes was spent controlling her breathing, controlling her drift, controlling the animal part of her brain that kept screaming about the drop below her. Except there was no below. There was only more dark forever, and somehow that was worse. She reached the station's underside where the dead sections were, the old refinery decks that hadn't held pressure in decades, and she found what she'd hoped to find. A maintenance hatch, the kind every station of this type had, corroded and forgotten, its manual release still stubbornly turnable under her gloved hands. She worked it open a quarter turn at a time, feeling the old mechanism fight her, and she slipped inside into a corridor of drifting rust and killed the outer hatch behind her. The dead sections of Tomb Harbor were a tomb in truth. Her helmet lamp cut a narrow cone through decades of floating debris, frozen droplets of some long-spilled coolant, hanging in the vacuum like tiny gray pearls. A work glove empty, turning slowly end over end. The wreckage of the refinery's old and violent death, whatever it had been. She moved through it slowly, checking her map against the reality, and the reality mostly matched, because refineries of this generation were all built to the same handful of plans, and Rel had lived inside one of them. She found the ore transfer gantry after 90 minutes of careful, patient, terrifying work through the dead crawls, 90 minutes in which every distant creak of the station's cooling metal made her freeze and wait and listen to her own heart. The gantry was exactly where the plan said it would be, a great dead arm of the station, built to reach out and mate with an ore hauler's aft cargo interface, to suck a hold full of raw ore out of a ship's belly in a single automated gulp. It hadn't moved in decades, but it was still mated to something now, because the Deepwake had docked at the one live ring, and its aft holds pressed right up against the gantry's old coupling, and Rel floated up to the coupling and put her gloved hand on it and felt, very faintly, the vibration of a living ship on the other side. He was there, right there, on the far side of a meter of dead metal. Now came the part of the plan she'd hated most when she designed it, because there was no clever way around it. The gantry coupling was sealed, dead, unpowered, its automatic systems long since gone. To get through it she would have to cut, and cutting made light and made heat, and if the aft holds were pressurized, made a scream of escaping air that would bring 11 armed people running. Unless she cut into the coupling's own internal void first. Refinery gantries had a buffer space built into the coupling, a dead air chamber meant to catch spillage, and if she could get into that chamber and pressurize it to match the hold before she cut the final wall, then there'd be no rush of air, no scream, nothing but a quiet, careful hole opening into the dark of the aft hold. It was fiddly, dangerous, slow work. It was salvage work. It was exactly the kind of unglamorous, patient, invisible task that no admiral would ever have designed a rescue around, and it was the only thing that was going to bring the boy home. Rel got to work. It took her 3 hours. She cut into the buffer chamber first, slow, shielded cuts, her body curled around the tool to hide its light. She sealed the outer breach behind her with patch foam from her salvage kit, the same foam she'd used 100 times to stop a hull leak in an emergency. She cracked a small charge of atmosphere from her own suit's reserve into the buffer chamber, watching the little pressure gauge she'd jury-rigged, bleeding it up gram by gram until it read close to what a ship's hold would hold. And only then, with the buffer chamber pressurized and her heart going like a hammer, did she start on the final wall, the thin inner skin of the Deepwake's aft hold. She cut a hole the size of a dinner plate, and no air screamed, and she pushed the disc of metal inward with agonizing slowness so it wouldn't clang, catching it in her gloved hand, and she looked through the hole into the dark of the hold. And 2 eyes looked back at her. The boy was pressed into the far corner of the hold, as far from the crew door as he could get, wedged behind a strut with his knees drawn up to his chin, and he was watching the hole she'd cut with the flat, still, terrible attention of a child who had learned that any change in his world was probably a bad one. He was small. That was the thing that hit Rel like a fist, how small he was. She'd known he was 7. She'd said the number to herself 100 times. But numbers weren't this. A silver-skinned child in a filthy nightclothes gone gray, huddled in a freezing hold that smelled of old ore and fear, his amber eyes, his mother's eyes, exactly his mother's eyes, fixed on her with a wariness no 7-year-old should ever have learned. He didn't cry out, he didn't move, he just watched. Rel held very still half through the hole, and she did the only thing she could think to do, which was to make herself as small and as gentle as a person can make themselves. She lifted her hands empty, slow. She reached up and carefully unsealed her helmet. The hold had air, thin and cold and foul but breathable, and she pulled it back so he could see her face, a real face, tired and human and afraid, so that whatever he'd been imagining coming through the walls, it would be less than this. "Hey," she said very quietly, her voice came out rough. "Hey, Ilvin, that's your name, right, Ilvin?" The boy's eyes flickered. Recognition, at the sound of his own name in this dark place where no one had used it kindly in a long time. "I'm not one of them," Rel said. "I know you don't have any reason to believe that, but I'm not. I came from your mother." She saw him flinch at the word, saw something crack open in the flat wariness of his face, and she pushed gently at it. "Your mother sent me, Queen Sarena. She's been looking for you every single day since you disappeared. She never stopped, not for 1 hour. She sent me to bring you home." The boy's mouth worked. When he spoke, his voice was a thread hoarse from disuse and cold. He stopped, swallowed, in the trade tongue that the Valen used with outsiders, small and careful. "You're a human." "Yeah," Rel said, and despite everything, something in her almost laughed. "Yeah, I'm a human. Ugly, I know. We come like this." She kept her hands where he could see them. "My name's Rel, and I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to do exactly what I say and be very, very quiet, because there are people on this ship who don't know I'm here, and it needs to stay that way. Can you do that? Can you be quiet with me?" For a long moment the boy didn't move. Rel could see the calculation happening behind those amber eyes, the terrible, adult calculation of a child who has learned that trust is dangerous. She didn't rush him. She'd learned in a life full of frightened creatures and frightened people that you cannot rush trust. You can only make yourself safe to give it to and wait. "They said," the boy whispered, "they said my mother stopped looking. They said everyone stopped. They said no one was coming." And there it was, the cruelty of it laid bare. They told him that. To keep him quiet, to keep him from hoping, to keep him from screaming for a rescue they wanted him to believe would never come, his captors had told a 7-year-old that his mother had given up, that the whole galaxy had forgotten him, that he was alone. Something went hard and cold and furious in Rel's chest, and she let it because it was clean and it steadied her. "They lied," she said, and she put every ounce of the truth she had into it, low and flat and certain. "They lied to you, Ilvin. Your mother never stopped for 1 second. She turned her whole kingdom upside down looking for you. She stood in front of 100 lords who told her to give up, and she told them no. She sent me because I was the one who figured out where you were. She held his gaze. I flew for weeks to get here. I've been sitting outside this station for 2 days watching that door, and I cut through a wall with my own hands to reach you. Does that sound like nobody's coming? The boy stared at her, and then his face crumpled, not into loud crying. He'd learned somewhere in these long weeks that loud was dangerous, but into the silent, shaking, terrible weeping of a child who has been holding something impossible for far too long and has just been given permission to put it down. His shoulders shook. Tears ran down his gray-silver face and dropped off his chin. "It's okay," Rel whispered, pushing the rest of the way through the hole into the freezing hold, moving to him slow and careful as you'd move to a wounded animal. "It's okay. I've got you. I've got you now. Nobody's leaving you here. Not me, not your mother, nobody. You're going home." She reached him and she gathered him up. And he was so light, so cold, so small, and he clung to her flight jacket with both hands and pressed his face into her shoulder and shook. And Rel Ashcombe held a stolen prince in the dark of a smuggler's hold and made him a promise with her whole body, the way you make the promises that matter, not with words, but with the simple, immovable fact of your arms not letting go. "I've got you," she said again into his hair. "I've got you. Now let's get you home." Getting in had been the patient part. Getting out was going to be the fast part, and the fast part is always where things break. Rel's plan for the exit was the same as her plan for the entrance, in reverse, back through the hole into the pressurized buffer chamber, through the dead gantry, through the maintenance crawls of the dead station, out the corroded hatch, and across the half-kilometer of dark to the margin. But the plan had been built for one person moving quietly, and now she had a second, smaller person who had no suit. She'd known that would be true. She'd thought about it in the cold days of watching. There was no way a 7-year-old had a vac suit stashed in a smuggler's hold. So she'd brought the only answer she had, and it was an ugly one. A rescue bag, a soft-sided emergency pod, barely more than a pressurized sack with an air supply, meant for hauling an unconscious crewman across a short vacuum gap. It was not comfortable. It was not dignified. It was going to be, for a frightened child, a terrifying claustrophobic dark, and Rel was going to have to convince him to climb into it willingly and let her seal him inside and carry him across the void. She knelt in front of him in the cold hold, and she told him the truth, because she'd already learned that this particular child could smell a lie. "Ilvain, listen to me. To get you back to my ship, we have to cross a little bit of space where there's no air. You don't have a suit. So I have this." She pulled the rescue bag from where she'd clipped it, held it up so he could see the ugliness of it. "And it's going to keep you safe, but it's going to be dark inside and small, and you won't be able to see me. And I know that's scary. I know it's really scary, but I'm going to be holding on to it the whole time. My hands are going to be on it every second. I won't let go, not for anything." She held his eyes. "Do you trust me?" And the boy, who had every reason in the universe not to trust anyone ever again, who had been lied to about his own mother's love, who had learned that the walls could open and bad things could come through, looked at the dark, ugly bag and looked at Rel's tired human face, and he did the bravest thing Rel had ever seen anyone do. He nodded. "Okay," Rel breathed. "Okay, good. You're braver than most grown people I know, you know that." She helped him into the bag, tucking his thin, cold limbs in gently, keeping her voice low and steady the whole time. "I'm right here. You hear my voice, I'm right here. I'm going to seal it now, and then you're going to hear me tapping like this." She tapped twice on the fabric. "And every time you hear 2 taps, that means I'm still here, I've still got you, okay? Every 2 taps means I'm here." "Okay," came the small, muffled voice from inside. Rel sealed the bag, checked the air, and tapped twice. 2 taps came back from inside, small knuckles against the fabric. He was answering her, telling her he heard. Something in Rel's chest twisted so hard she had to stop for a second and breathe. "Good boy," she whispered. "Here we go." And that was when, from the forward door of the hold, she heard the sound she'd spent 3 days praying not to hear. The heavy clunk of a lock disengaging, and a man's voice, muffled through the hatch, calling out something about the evening meal. The crewman with the tray had come early. Everything after that happened in the space of 4 breaths. Rel had time for exactly one clear thought, and it was the right one. The hatch opened toward the corner where the boy had been kept, and the crewman's eyes would go there first, to the place his prisoner always was, and for 1/2 second he would see an empty corner and his brain would refuse to understand it. That 1/2 second was all she had. She did not reach for her sidearm. If she fired, the sound would bring the other 10, and the whole ship would come down on her, and the boy in the bag would be a bargaining chip or a corpse. The gun was the thing that lost her everything. So she did the salvage thing. She used what the room gave her. The hatch swung in and a broad human shape filled it, backlit, a tray of food in his hands, saying, "Up, kid, foods," and stopping because the corner was empty. His head turned, and in the moment his brain stalled on the impossible empty corner, Rel, already moving, already committed, swung the heavy salvage cutter she still held not at the man but at the light panel beside the hatch, the single dim work light that lit the hold. It shattered. The hold went black, and in the sudden dark, the crewman's startled shout was not a word but just a bark of confusion, and Rel was already past him, not attacking, never attacking, just moving, the sealed rescue bag clutched to her chest, sliding along the wall she'd memorized in the light toward the cut hole she'd made in the back. "Hey, hey," the crewman was shouting now, flailing in the dark, the tray clattering. "He's someone's, the kid's gone, the kid's gone." The whole ship woke up. Rel heard it come alive around her, running feet somewhere forward, an alarm klaxon starting its ugly whoop, voices shouting over each other. She didn't listen to the words. She listened to the geometry of it, the way she'd have listened to a debris field going unstable, and she poured herself and her small precious cargo through the hole in the aft wall and into the buffer chamber, and she sealed the patch foam plug behind her with a slap of her palm, and the shouting cut off into muffled nothing, and she was in the dead gantry with the boy in her arms and a ship full of frightened, dangerous people between her and the void. She tapped twice on the bag. 2 taps came back, fast and hard and scared. "Still here," she breathed. "Still got you, going fast now, hold on." She went fast now. The patient, invisible artist of the entrance was gone, and in her place was something else, something Rel had only met a few times in her life, in the worst moments. A cold, clear, ferocious competence that took over when there was no more time to be afraid. She flew through the dead crawls of Tomb Harbor hauling the rescue bag, and behind her, faintly, through the station's bones, she could feel the Deepwake's crew tearing their own ship apart looking for a prisoner who was already gone, not yet understanding that the walls had been cut, not yet understanding which way, buying her seconds with their confusion. They were amateurs. They were frightened, and frightened amateurs waste their first minutes on disbelief. She reached the corroded outer hatch. She worked it open one-handed, the other arm locked around the boy, and she came out into the dark on the underside of the station, and there, 1/2 kilometer across the void, was the margin, dark and waiting, and between it and her was nothing but vacuum and 40 minutes of careful hand-over-hand crossing that she absolutely did not have time for anymore. So she wasn't going to be careful. She was going to be fast, and fast meant thrusters, and thrusters meant they'd see her. Let them see her. She had the boy. All that mattered now was the gap, and the gap was seconds against minutes. The seconds it would take her to cross under thrust, against the minutes it would take them to figure out the walls were cut, get to a ship and give chase. She had a lead. It was thin. It was all she had. Rel clipped the rescue bag hard to the front of her suit, both her arms free now, tapped twice, 2 taps back, and she said, "Big push now, kiddo. Hold on tight." And she fired her thrusters and threw herself off the station into the dark. She crossed the void in 90 seconds of hard burn. The boy pressed to her chest, the burnt-out star a dull red coal below and the dark forever above, and she felt the exact moment the Deepwake sensor mast caught her, felt it the way you feel a spotlight on the back of your neck, and she did not look back. She just flew, and she slammed into the Margin's hull hard enough to bruise, and she got the airlock open and got herself and the boy inside and cycled it, and she was through. She was in her own ship. And she peeled the rescue bag open, and there he was, gray-faced and gasping and alive, blinking in the light. "You're okay," she said, half laughing, half sobbing, checking him over with shaking hands. "You're okay, you're on my ship, you did it, you did so good." And then, because the Deepwake was already lighting its engines behind her, she left him wrapped in a thermal blanket in the co-pilot's seat, and she threw herself into the pilot's chair, and she launched the courier drone. It shot away towards Semira faster than anything else in the system, carrying its message: alive, aboard, coordinates, come now. And Rel watched it go and knew it would take a day and a half to reach the Valen, and the fleet would take another day to come. And none of that mattered for the next 10 minutes, because the next 10 minutes were between her and Orsk Vandry. The Deepwake came after her the way a wounded bear comes after you, slow to start, and then terrifyingly committed. It was bigger than the Margin, and it had real weapons, and if it caught her, it would end her. But it was 30 years old and built to haul ore, not to chase couriers, and the one thing Rel had, the only thing, was that her ugly little ship was the fastest thing she'd ever flown. She lit her overpowered drive and she ran. And she ran the way she'd learned to run from patrols along the ragged edge, using the debris and the dead cargo pods and the burnt star's own gravity, threading her way through the graveyard of the dead system at speeds that would have gotten her killed if she'd hesitated for even a heartbeat. Vandry's voice came over the open channel, ragged, furious, frightened. "Courier boat, whoever you are. You've got something of mine, and you are not going to make it out of this system. Turn around and hand it back, and I'll let you live. That's a better deal than you deserve." Rel keyed the channel. She had one thing to say, and she said it flat and cold. "He's not something," she said. "He's a 7-year-old, and you told him his mother stopped looking for him, so no, I don't think I'll be handing him back." She cut the channel. There was nothing else to say to a man like that. The chase ran for 11 minutes, and they were the longest 11 minutes of Rel Ashcombe's life. The Deepwake's guns spoke twice, and both times Rel felt the shots go wide because she'd already been somewhere else, already jinking, already reading the geometry the way she'd read the debris field, the way she'd read the shadows her whole life. The boy sat white-knuckled in the co-pilot's chair and did not scream, did not cry out, just held on and watched her fly with those enormous amber eyes. And once, when a near miss slammed the ship sideways, she heard him gasp, and she said, without taking her eyes off the field, "Still got you. Still got you. Almost there." And she felt him settle, and she thought, "He trusts me. This kid who has no reason to trust anyone trusts me to fly him out of this, and I am not going to let him down." She threaded the last of the debris and hit the system's edge and the jump point, and the Deepwake was falling behind now, its heavy engines unable to match her mad, overpowered sprint, Vandry screaming on a channel she'd stopped listening to. Rel spun up the jump drive with hands that were finally, now that it was almost over, starting to shake. The numbers climbed. The Deepwake fired one last desperate shot that clipped the Margin's stern and set an alarm howling, and Rel ignored it, watching the jump numbers, watching them climb. And at the top of the count she reached over and put one hand on the boy's shoulder, 2 taps, out of habit now, 2 taps against him, and she said, "Here we go. Hold on. We're going home." And the Margin jumped, and the dead system and the Deepwake and Tomb Harbor and the whole nightmare fell away into nothing behind them, and there was only the clean, silent gray of jump space, and a stolen prince, alive, safe, sitting in the co-pilot's chair of an ugly little courier boat, going home. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then a small voice, unsteady, "Is it, are we, did we?" "We did it," Rel said. She let out a breath that seemed to come from the soles of her feet. "We got out. They can't follow us in the jump. We're clear, Ilving, it's over. You're going home." And the boy looked at her, this human who had come through the wall in the dark, who had told him the truth about his mother, who had held onto a bag in the void and tapped twice so he'd know she was there. And his face did the crumpling thing again. And this time Rel reached over and unbuckled him and pulled him into her lap in the pilot's chair and let him cry as loud as he wanted. Because Loud wasn't dangerous anymore. Loud was safe now. And she held him while he sobbed out weeks of terror. And she did not tell him to stop. The jump to the edge of Vale and space took most of a day, and Rel spent it learning who Prince Ilvin actually was, underneath the fear. He was, it turned out, a talker. Once he decided you were safe, the words came out of him in a flood, weeks of them, dammed up and finally released. He told her about his tutors and the pet he missed, and the way the palace looked when both moons were up. He told her, in the careful roundabout way children tell terrible things, about the night they'd taken him, the passage that shouldn't have opened, the hands over his mouth, the long dark journey in a crate. He told her about the crew, and Rel filed away every name and detail he gave her, because the Valen would want them, and because she wanted, personally, to make sure Orsk Vandry, and every one of his people answered for a room where they'd told a child his mother had forgotten him. And he asked her more than once in the small hours of the jump when he couldn't sleep, the same question turned different ways. Why did you come? Nobody else came. Everybody stopped. Why did you? And Rel tried to answer it honestly, because he'd earned honesty. Because I could, she said, the first time, which wasn't enough. Because everybody who could have come was too big to fit through the crack, she said, the second time, which was truer but too clever. The third time, deep in the gray, with the boy's head heavy against her shoulder and his voice half asleep, she gave him the real one. Because somebody had to, she said quietly. And because when I heard about you, about a little kid taken and everybody saying give up, he's gone, I couldn't. I just couldn't let it be true. It didn't matter that I was nobody. It didn't matter that it was probably impossible. Somebody had taken a child and everybody was about to just let that stand, and I couldn't stand it. She was quiet a moment. Where I come from, we're not much. We're young, we're small, nobody thinks much of us. But we've got this one thing. When something's wrong and everybody says it can't be fixed, that's exactly when we get stubborn. That's when we plant our feet. It's kind of our whole thing, a tired laugh. It gets us killed a lot, honestly, but sometimes it gets a kid home. The boy was quiet for so long she thought he'd fallen asleep. Then he said very softly, I'm glad it was a human. Rel held him a little tighter, and did not trust herself to answer, and flew on toward home. There is a part of every rescue that no one tells stories about, and it is the part that comes after the running stops. Rel had lived that truth before, on smaller jobs, the strange flat quiet that settles in once the danger is gone, and there is suddenly nothing to do with your hands and nowhere for the fear to go. On the long jump home, in the gray hours when Ilvin finally slept, she felt it come. The competence that had carried her through the wall and across the void drained out of her all at once, and what was left was a woman shaking in a pilot's chair, staring at the gray of jump space, understanding for the first time, now that it was safe to understand it, exactly how many ways it could have gone wrong. If the crewman had come 30 seconds earlier, before she'd sealed the boy in the bag, if the light panel had been made of tougher stuff, if the Deepwake's guns had been aimed by someone competent instead of someone frightened, if the buffer chamber had held pressure poorly, or the patch foam had failed, or the boy had panicked in the dark of the bag and thrashed, or any one of 40 small invisible things had tipped the wrong way, then she would be dead, and the boy would be dead or worse, and no one would ever have known she'd even tried. She would have been one more name that went to find the Silver Queen's son and never came back. She let herself shake. She'd learned that too across the years, that you had to let the fear out afterward or it stayed in you and rotted. So she sat in the dark of her ship with a sleeping prince beside her, and she let her hands tremble and her breath go ragged, and she did not fight it, and slowly, over an hour, it passed, the way weather passes, and left her clean. And then she did the thing she always did to steady herself. She got up quietly, so as not to wake the boy, and she went through her ship and she fixed things. The stern had taken a hit from Vandry's parting shot. She patched it. The jump drive had run hot. She cooled and cleaned it. She checked her air, her water, her fuel, the thousand small systems that kept a person alive in the dark, and in the tending of them she found herself again, because that was who she was. Not a hero, not a legend, but a person who kept small broken things running, who had simply, this once, kept a small broken child running too. When Ilvin woke hours later, she was elbow-deep in an access panel with grease on her face, and he watched her work with fascination, and then he asked if he could help, and she, after a moment's thought, handed him a light to hold and let him. And so the Prince of 100 Worlds spent a stretch of his journey home holding a work light for a human mechanic in the belly of a courier boat, learning the names of tools, and it was, he would say years later, one of the happiest hours of his childhood, because for that hour he was not a hostage or an heir or a symbol, but just a boy helping his friend fix a ship. "Why don't you have a crew?" he asked her at one point, passing her a spanner she'd named for him. "Never wanted the responsibility," Rel said, and then, because he'd earned honesty, corrected herself. "That's not true, wanted it fine, just never found people I trusted enough to keep alive." She tightened a fitting. "It's a lot keeping people alive. You've got to care about them, and then you've got to be good enough that the caring doesn't get them killed. Most folks can do one or the other. Both's rare." She glanced at him. "You keep people alive today, holding that light, you know that. Fed me tools so I could fix the drive so we get home. That's crew work. You're crew now." Ilvain sat up straighter and held the light with tremendous seriousness for the rest of the repair, and Rel hid a smile in the machinery. The Valan, for their part, spent that day and a half in an agony of anticipation that their whole culture of patience did nothing to ease. Word of the drone's message had spread through the palace and then, unstoppably, beyond it. By the time the Queen's cutter launched, the whole of Semira knew. The prince was alive, the prince was coming home, and he was being brought by a human, a lone human, the nobody in the stained coat whom the lords had wanted turned away. The city that had gone silent with grief 72 days before now filled with a sound it had almost forgotten how to make. In the low quarters where the working Valan lived, they lit the old lamps of homecoming, the ones kept for ships long overdue. On the bridges of light, crowds gathered to watch the empty sky where the cutter had gone, waiting for it to come back full. Lord Kesh stood on the palace's highest terrace through that whole long wait, and he did a great deal of thinking. He was old and he had been wrong, and he was Valan enough to sit with both of those facts honestly. He had counseled the Queen to grieve. He had called the human a fool or a fraud. He had believed with the settled certainty of 40,000 years of memory that if the mighty could not find the boy, then the boy could not be found. That power was the measure of what was possible, and that the small and the young and the poor simply did not do great things because greatness required greatness. And a courier in a torn coat had just proven him wrong on every count. He turned it over and over as he waited, and slowly he came to understand the thing the Queen had understood days before in her chambers, when she'd asked him which he'd found more often to be liars, those who admit they might be wrong, or those who swear they cannot be. It was not that the human was mightier than the warlords. She was not. It was that mightiness had been the wrong tool. The boy had been hidden in exactly the place that power could not reach, a small dark crack in the galaxy, guarded by frightened people who would kill their hostage the instant power came looking. And into a crack like that, only a small thing could go. The Valan had spent 72 days trying to force a large key into a small lock, and a human had simply been the right size. There was a lesson in that, Kesh thought, that went far beyond one child and one rescue. The Valan had grown so large and so old and so mighty that they had forgotten there were doors their mightiness could not open. They had come to believe that the powerful were the only ones who mattered. And a young species they had dismissed as loud and reckless children had just shown them, at the cost of one woman's terror in the dark, that the reckless young sometimes went precisely where the wise old could not, that a civilization needed its small, stubborn ones as much as it needed its great ones, perhaps more. When the cutter finally came back over the horizon and the whole city roared, Lord Kesh was the first of the lords to go down to the landing platform, and when the human stepped off her ugly little ship in her stained coat, blinking at the crowd and the noise and the lamps, plainly wishing she were anywhere else, it was old Lord Kesh who reached her first, and it was old Lord Kesh who, before the Queen, before the ceremony, before any of it, bowed to her, deep and full, the bow of an elder to someone worthy, and said, in the trade tongue so she would understand it, "I called you a fool, I was the fool, forgiven old man, shield of the ascendancy. You have taught the eldest people alive a thing we had forgotten, and we will not forget it again." And Rel, who had no idea what to do with any of this, went red to the ears and mumbled that it was fine, really, anybody would've, and Lord Kesh laughed. The first laugh he'd laughed in 72 days, because that was, of course, exactly the answer that proved the Queen right about her. She left in the end the way she'd come, quietly, and on her own terms in her own ugly faithful ship, with a full tank and no fanfare she could avoid. But she did not leave the same, none of them did. The galaxy that had told itself the joke about the mad silver queen who would pay anything now told a different story entirely, and it told it in the places that mattered, the docks, the bars, the long silent stretches between the jumps, where the small people lived. They told it to the young ones just starting out, the couriers and the wreckers and the ones who'd already been told 100 times that they were nobody, that they'd never do anything that mattered, that the great things belonged to the great. Remember Ashkum, they told them. She was nobody too. She had a junk ship and a torn coat and a feeling in her gut, and she went where the whole galaxy said give up, and she carried a kid out of the dark, and a queen of the eldest people alive knelt down to her. So don't you let anybody tell you you're too small to matter. Being small's the whole point. Small's how you fit through the crack. And somewhere out in the dark, in an ugly little courier boat, the woman they were talking about flew on toward the next thing that needed doing, wearing a plain silver band at her wrist that she'd never quite gotten comfortable with, and not thinking of herself as a legend at all, just as a person who kept small broken things running, and who had learned once in the cold dark of a smuggler's hold that a child was the most important small thing there was. The courier drone reached Semera a day and a half after Rel launched it, and it changed everything. It arrived in the dead of the Valan night, and it did not wait for morning or protocol. It burned straight into the palace's receiving array and delivered its message on every royal channel at once, 6 words, in Rel's plain flat trade tongue, unadorned by any of the ceremony the Valan wrapped around important things. Alive, aboard my ship, coming home, and a set of coordinates and the name Deepwake and a single line that the analysts would puzzle over and then understand. They told him you stopped looking. He knows now that you never did. Queen Sarana was woken by the Chamberlain, the same Chamberlain who had woken her 72 days before with the empty bed and the gray face. This time his face was not gray. This time his hands shook for a different reason and his voice broke on the words as he said them. Great Queen, the human, she has him. She has the prince. She is bringing him home. And Queen Sarana of the Valan, who had not wept where anyone could see for 300 years, who had stood before 100 lords and refused to grieve, sat down very suddenly on the edge of her bed and put her face in her silver hands and wept. The fleet launched within the hour, not to chase now, but to escort, to meet the ugly little courier boat at the edge of Valan space and bring it home in glory. But the Queen did not send the fleet ahead of herself. She did a thing that scandalized her lords and that she did not care about scandalizing them within the slightest. She boarded the fastest ship in her navy, a needle-thin racing cutter kept for ceremonial speed runs, and she went herself. She, the Queen of 100 worlds, flew to the border of her own kingdom to meet her son, because she had promised herself in the dark days that if he ever came home, she would be the first face he saw, and she was not going to break that promise for anything, least of all dignity. They met in the empty dark between the stars, at the ragged edge of veil and space, where the great silver cutter of the Queen and the ugly patched courier of the human came together and matched velocities, and mated their airlocks with a soft mechanical kiss. Rel brought the boy to the lock herself. She'd cleaned him up as best she could with what the margin had, washed the gray dirt off his silver skin, found him a clean shirt of her own that hung on him like a tent, combed his hair with her fingers. He looked better. He looked like a prince again, almost, under the borrowed shirt and the borrowed courage. But he held Rel's hand the whole way to the lock, and he did not let go, and when the outer door cycled and the light of the Valen cutter spilled through, Rel felt his grip tighten to the point of pain. "It's okay," she murmured, kneeling beside him. "It's okay. This is the part where you go home. This is the good part. Go on." And then Queen Sarina stepped through the airlock, and the boy went still. She was in a plain gray traveling cloak. No crown, no ceremony. 3 centuries of ruling stripped away to leave only a mother who had crossed her whole kingdom in the night. And she stopped in the airlock and looked at her son, and her son looked at her, and for one terrible frozen second neither of them moved, because they had both been hurt, because they had both been told the other might be lost, because 72 days is a very long time in the life of a child, and the boy in that moment was not sure, quite, that this was real. Then Ilving made a small broken sound and let go of Rel's hand and ran, and the Queen dropped to her knees on the deck of the courier boat, crown of 100 worlds forgotten, and caught him, and folded her whole body around him, and the two of them held each other and shook, and neither of them said a single word, because there were no words that would fit. And Rel Ashkum stepped back against the wall of her own ship and looked away, because some things you don't watch, and let them have it. It was a long time before the Queen looked up. When she did, her amber eyes, wet and unashamed of it, found Rel, still pressed back against the wall in her rust-colored jacket, trying to make herself small, trying to disappear the way she always did when a job was done, and it was time for the important people to take over. Sarina rose. She kept one hand on her son's shoulder because she was not going to stop touching him for a good while yet, but she rose to her full silver height, and she looked at the small, tired human who had done the thing her whole civilization could not, and Rel braced for the reward speech, the formal gratitude, the payment, the door. She'd done a lot of jobs. She knew how they ended. You did the hard part, and then the big people thanked you and you went back to the dark. But the Queen did not thank her the way you thank a hired hand. Queen Sarina of the Valen, ruler of 100 worlds, walked across the deck of the courier boat, and she stopped in front of Rel Ashkum, and then, slowly, deliberately, in full view of her own son and the Valen officers crowding the airlock behind her, she knelt. She knelt to a human. A gasp went through the Valen behind her. It was a thing that had, quite literally, never happened in the 40,000-year recorded memory of their people. A Valen sovereign on her knees before an outsider, before a human, before a nobody in a stained coat. Lord Kesh, watching from the cutter, would say afterward that he felt the floor of the universe shift under him. "Your Majesty," Rel started, appalled, reaching to raise her up. "No, please, you can't. I'm not. Get up, please." "I can," said the Queen, "and I will, and you will let me." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. "Do you know what you have done, Rel Ashkum?" "I found your kid," Rel said, helpless. "Anybody would've." "No," the word cut clean. "That is the lie the small tell about themselves, and I will not let you tell it in front of me. Not anybody, not 100 anybodies. I sent the word to every corner of this galaxy. Warlords came. Fleets came. The proudest and richest and most powerful beings beneath these stars came and stood in my hall and swore to me they would succeed, and every one of them failed or lied or never even tried because the truth was too small for them to see. You," her voice caught and she let it, "you came with nothing. No fleet, no proof, no promise. You came and you told me you might be wrong, and then you flew alone into the worst place in my borderlands, and you cut through a wall with your own 2 hands, and you carried my son out of the dark, and you asked me for fuel and one drone. She shook her head slowly. The mighty of the galaxy could not do what you did, and you did it because you refused to believe it couldn't be done. Rel had no answer. Her throat had closed. My son told me in the lock before he could speak of anything else, the Queen went on, softer now. He told me they said I had stopped looking, that I had given up, that I had forgotten him. Her hand tightened on Ilvin's shoulder and the boy pressed into her side. They tried to kill the one thing in him that would have kept him fighting, his knowing that he was loved, that he was wanted, that someone was coming. And do you know what saved that in him? Not his mother's fleet, not his mother's power. A human in a torn coat who came through the wall and knelt in the dark and told him the truth. You gave him back the thing they tried to take, not just his freedom. His faith that he mattered. The Queen's voice dropped to almost nothing. There is no fuel that pays for that. There is no drone. There is no fortune in my 100 worlds. She rose then, at last, and she took Rel's hands in her own silver ones, and she made her decision. And it was a decision that would ripple across the galaxy for 100 years. So I will not pay you, Queen Sarina said. I will do something else. Hear me, all of you, and carry it to every world that will listen. She lifted her voice now so that the officers and the recorders and the whole watching galaxy would hear it. From this hour, Rel Ashcombe of the humans is named Shield of the Ascendancy, kin to the throne, sister to my son, bound to my house by a debt that we will honor for as long as the Valan endure. No human shall ever again be turned from my hall as a nobody. No human shall ever again be called too small to matter in the sight of the Valan. For the youngest and smallest of the peoples of the stars did what the mightiest could not, and she did it not for gold, but because she could not stand to let a child be lost. Her amber eyes shone. Let the galaxy remember it. Let them remember that the great and the powerful stood in my hall and promised me everything, and gave me nothing, and that in the end my son was carried home in the arms of a human who promised me nothing and gave me the world. And that was the reaction that shocked the galaxy. Not gold, not a fleet, not a throne, but a queen of the eldest people alive kneeling to the youngest, and elevating a nobody courier to the kin of 100 worlds, and telling every star that could hear her that she had been wrong about humanity, and was grateful past all measure to have been proven so. The story of it ran ahead of the fleet all the way back to Semira, and did not stop there. It ran to the proud old species who had always looked down on the loud young humans, and it made them look again. It ran to the warlords who had failed and shamed them. It ran to the outer systems, to the docks and the bars where hard people told each other stories to pass the long shifts, and there it changed from a joke into something else. Remember the Silver Queen, they'd said before. Remember all the big names who struck out. Now they said it differently. Now they said, remember the courier, remember Ashcombe, remember that it wasn't the big ones who did it. It was the small, stubborn one who wouldn't quit. Rel stayed at the palace of the Valan for a season, because the Queen asked her to, and because a small silver-skinned boy would not, for a good long while, fall asleep unless he knew she was somewhere in the same building. She never quite got comfortable with the honors. She wore the Shield of the Ascendancy, a plain band of silver at her wrist, all she'd let them give her, but she flinched every time a lord bowed to her, and she kept trying to carry her own bags, and once she was found in the palace kitchens at midnight, having a cup of bad coffee with the staff, because that was where she felt like a person instead of a legend. The Valan found this baffling and slowly endearing. She was not what they had imagined a hero would be, and that in the end was the whole point. Orsk Vandry and the crew of the Deepwake were taken within the week, hunted down by a Valan fleet that had all the coordinates it needed, and the buyer behind them. It turned out to be exactly the kind of small, ugly thing Rel had guessed, a coalition of border interests who'd wanted a royal hostage to force a trade concession. Nothing grand, nothing worthy, just greed and cruelty wearing the mask of politics. They were undone entirely. The Valan were thorough. But Rel asked one thing of the queen regarding them, and the queen granted it, that the crewmen be told, each one personally, that the child they'd lied to about his mother's love had gone home to arms that had never once stopped reaching for him. Let them carry that, Rel said. Let them know the lie failed. And they were told. On the day she finally left, because she was who she was and palaces were not her place, and there was a whole galaxy of small, stubborn people out there who might need someone shaped exactly wrong for the trap. Prince Ilvin came to the landing platform to see her off, in the thin, high air above the white spires, and he did not cry, because he was braver now, though his chin wobbled. "You'll come back," he said. It was not quite a question. "Course I will," Rel said, kneeling to his level. "I'm kin to your house, remember, sister to the prince. Your mom made it official and everything. You can't get rid of me now." She reached out and tapped him twice on the shoulder. 2 taps, still here, still got you, and he understood, and his face broke into the first real, unshadowed 7-year-old grin she'd seen on him. "You be brave. You be kind. And you remember, when everybody says a thing can't be done, and it's the right thing, that's exactly when you plant your feet. Deal." "Deal," said the Prince of 100 Worlds, and he threw his arms around the neck of the human who had carried him out of the dark, and held on. Queen Sarina watched from the platform's edge, one hand raised in farewell, her amber eyes bright, and Rel Ashkum shouldered her old duffel bag and climbed into her ugly, patched, faithful little ship, and flew out into the dark. Not a nobody anymore, though she'd never quite believe it, but a name the whole galaxy now knew, the small, stubborn human who had gone where the mighty would not, and refused to let a child be lost, and shown the eldest people alive that the measure of a soul was never its size. Behind her, on a floating city of white spires, a queen who had learned to weep held her son's hand and watched a courier boat climb into the stars, and thought that the galaxy had been right about one thing after all. Humans were reckless and stubborn, and threw themselves at impossible things with no regard for the odds. She had simply been wrong about whether that was a flaw.